Well, good morning. Can I welcome everyone to the 16th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee and the first meeting following the summer recess. If you're interested in the work of this committee and future meetings, you may be interested to know that we're now on Twitter, so feel free to follow us. Can I ask everyone to switch off their mobile phones as they do affect the broadcasting system? But witnesses should note that some members of the committee do consult their tablets rather than paper copies of the papers. So they will be accessing the briefing papers for this meeting. Item 1 is declaration of interest, and I'd like to welcome Mary Fee and Mark Griffin as new members of the committee and invite you to declare any relevant interests. Mary.
Can I refer committee to my declaration of interest on the parliamentary website?
Okay. And Mark?
No interest to declare.
Okay, thanks. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Elaine Murray and Margaret McCulloch for their worthwhile contributions to the work of this committee and wish them well on their new committees. Item 2 is items in private. The first item for today is to seek the agreement of the committee to take item 5 and 6 in private and to allow the committee to consider its scrutiny of the draft budget of 2014-15 and to consider the evidence that we'll hear later on from Audit Scotland. Our members agreed to take these items in private. That's fine, thank you. Agenda item 3 is housing, and today we're going to take evidence from the Minister for Housing and Welfare on a range of housing issues. So today can I welcome Margaret Burgess, Minister for Housing and Welfare, Kay Barton, Deputy Director, Housing Supply Division, Linda Leslie, Team Leader, Housing Strategy Team, and Stephen White, Head of Housing Options and Services Units. Can I welcome you all? And Minister, would you like to make a few opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener. If I could just make some comments about the housing bill that we're going to introduce later in the year. The bill will contain a range of provisions that will protect tenants, support improvements to the quality of housing and secure better outcomes for communities. Main items of the bill: it will end all right to buy entitlements. It will introduce a regulatory framework for letting agents to tackle those who do not meet industry standards of professionalism and conduct. It will create a new specialist private rented sector housing tribunal, increase flexibility in allocation of management of social housing so that landlords will be able to deliver improved outcomes for their tenants and the communities they live in. It will give local authorities greater enforcement powers to improve the quality of houses in the private sector by requiring owners to carry out work to repair and maintain their properties. And these measures will benefit all sectors and tenures. For example, ending the right to buy will prevent the sale of up to 15,500 social rented houses over the next 10 years, protecting the existing stock of social rented homes and enabling social landlords to help the many people in need of social housing. The provisions on the private rented sector will improve protection for tenants in a sector which has more than doubled from 5% of homes in 1999 to 11% in 2011. And I look forward to discussing the bill in detail following its introduction later in the year. And hopefully I can answer any questions you have this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. You mentioned the main policy aims of the forthcoming bill. I noticed you didn't mention anything about the modernising the licence of mobile homes and park homes, and we did have some discussion about that before the summer. Is that going to be in the bill or not?
That will be in the bill. We intend to improve the registered site owners, to licensed site owners, to register them, to put a time limit on the length of the site registration, which is currently, it runs forever. So that will be part of the bill. So we intend doing that within the housing bill, yes.
Okay, anyone have any more questions on the general aspects of the bill? We're just going to wait and see till when it comes. Okay. Gordon.
Thank you, Convener. I noticed on the Affordable Housing Supply Programme that was announced on the 8th of July that the City of Edinburgh had an increased allocation to £88 million. Can you clarify how much is currently allocated to the 3-year affordable housing supply budget in total? And is the £44 million an increase subsidy additional money?
The total affordable housing supply budget at the moment is just under £950 million. The £44 million that was announced, added to it, is new money to the affordable housing supply budget, and it came from a variety of sources. Some of it was the £20 million announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance from consequentials. Some of it was an unallocated sum, and there was some underspend in the regeneration and housing portfolio and from other portfolios, and that's where the £44 million came from, and it was then added to the affordable housing supply budget, so it is new to affordable housing.
Right. And the additional support per unit, which is roughly £16,000 per home, the reason for that being introduced, was that because banks were failing to lend, or was it housing associations not using all the reserves they had? I mean, you know, what was the reason for introducing an increase in that subsidy by £16,000?
The reason for introducing that, I think you may be aware that I set up a short-term working group of the major stakeholders to look at that, because it had been raised on a number of occasions, and the reasons were banks not lending to social landlords, or the way that the financing was being repriced for social landlords, and also the welfare reforms impact that's having on social landlords. So we set up the short-term working group to look at subsidies in particular, as they were saying clearly that the target that we had set, they would have difficulty meeting that target with the current subsidy rate, and that's why it was increased. The 16,000 figure was the top end of what they recommended, but anything else would have been a short-term measure, and we would be back in the same situation. So for that reason, and I would have to add, it's been very welcomed across the sector, and landlords are now saying yes, they can meet their programme and start the developing again, some that have not been doing it.
Okay, thanks very much.
Mary?
Can I just ask a couple of additional questions following on from what Gordon asked? The 44 million, can I be absolutely clear where that 44 million came from? Is it new money? Is it a portion of new money? Or is it, it was my understanding, it's underspend in unallocated funds?
I think, if I can just, I may ask Kay to come in on this later, but what I tried to say to Gordon MacDonald was that the £20 million was announced by John Swinney in May, and that was consequentials, new money to the Scottish Government. That was new money. There were some unallocated sum, and the figure may be, would I be right in saying it was £7 million that was unallocated within?
There was £10.8 million that was unallocated from earlier in the year. It had been announced for housing, but not specifically for the Affordable Housing Supply Programme.
Right. And the rest was underspend in, I think, £5.9 underspend from other portfolios.
Out with housing?
Out with housing, which then came to housing. So £44 million was added to the Affordable Housing Supply Programme.
And will that be split over the 3 years, or is it intended to use that money in 1 year?
That money has been allocated, I think, in two ways, £24 million in 2013-14 and £20 million in 2014-15.
And then the 950 million that's in the affordable housing budget, what is the projected number of affordable houses that you intend to build with that money?
Well, we've said clearly we have a target of affordable houses of 30,000 affordable houses by the end of this this government. So that is our target, and we intend that 44 million is not to build additional houses. It's what I was saying, is to help ensure that the target is met with the housing associations and landlords who were telling us that they would be unable to meet the target with the subsidy of 40,000, and that's why we increased the subsidy to ensure that we can meet our target.
So the 44 million is only to be used for the housing association? Yeah.
No, it's affordable housing.
Affordable housing.
It will be used for affordable housing, and it will be distributed through the resource planning assumptions to local authorities, as all of the affordable housing supply budget.
And the forecast for the number of houses that you've built, is it on track at the moment? How many houses have been started?
We are on track to meet our target of houses. Okay, have you got the chart with you? Target to do it. Certainly get the figures, but we are on target to meet that.
Yes, in the year 2011-12, which was the first of the 5 years, we built 6,882 new affordable homes. And last year, 2012-13, it was 6,009. So those first 2 years, we've achieved over the 6,000 per annum.
Okay. And the increase in the subsidy, what impact do you think that will have? How many additional homes do you think will be built because of that increase in the subsidy?
I think I'll repeat, what I said is that the increase in the subsidy was not specifically to increase the number of houses being built. It was to ensure that the target can be met and the housing associations could continue to build and local authorities could continue to build because of the welfare reforms and the bank lending, they were struggling to be able to finance meet our targets at the £40,000 subsidy, and for that reason we increased the subsidy, because otherwise, had we increased the subsidy and not given additional money, then we would have higher subsidy at less houses. So we're on target to meet our target of 30,000 houses by the end of this Parliament. We're target for 30,000 houses, and that's why the subsidy was increased. We didn't increase this and ask them to build more houses.
Is there a plan to increase the subsidy further?
There is no plans at present to increase the subsidy further. There has been no request to increase the subsidy further. We listened very carefully to our stakeholders on this, and we looked at a range of subsidies from £10,000 to £16,000, and clearly £10,000 would have been a short-term solution. Anything in between would have been short-term, and we took the bold decision to make it the £16,000, which was the highest that the group came up with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Minister, in terms of these houses being built, can you tell us how many will be built by councils? And do you have any idea of the distribution of them throughout the country? Because some parts of the country, including my own in Aberdeen, pressure on housing supply is huge. And I just wondered, how is it allocated across, this money allocated across the country?
Money is allocated to the local authorities under the agreed formula that we have with COSLA, and each local authority determines their own local housing strategy and the housing demand and needs in their area. They then work with their partners, whether it be housing associations, whether it be local authorities, to determine where the houses are to go, what the size of the houses are to be, and whether they're going to be built by partnership with housing associations, with developers, or whether they build houses themselves. So there are some areas where there's stock transfer, so clearly there won't be council houses built in those areas.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions on that part? Alex?
Much, Convener. I'd like to explore just very briefly what we've been doing and saying in the figures in the past few minutes. Now, what you appear to be saying is that progress against targets was not below trajectory before you added the additional grant, and that once the additional grant is added, progress against the trajectory will not be above target. What's the £16,000 extra per house for?
I think what I was saying is that we had met our targets in the previous 2 years. Our stakeholders, our social landlords, our developers were telling us it was going to be difficult to continue to do that, given the difficulties they were facing, both with welfare reforms and with the bank lending, and that they would be struggling in some to maintain that level of house building. And for that reason, we increased the subsidy.
So it's the additional subsidy is designed to ensure that you achieve targets in coming years.
It's yes, and that can be maintained.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. There's one other point I'd like to clarify, and it relates to what the government's priorities are within these targets. Now, we often hear in housing debates the government comparing the number of council houses being built currently to the number of council houses being built in periods in the past. And this seems to ignore the fact that many social houses in recent years weren't in fact built by councils but were built by housing associations. Does the government have within its structure and its logic, does the government intend to prioritise council houses as opposed to housing association houses?
No, that's not the position of the government. The position of the government is that we would wish 2/3 of our affordable housing supply to be in the social rented sector. It's not up to the government to determine whether that is for council houses or for whether that is housing associations, and it's back to what I said to the convener. It's about local authorities determining what is appropriate and right for their area. It's not about the government saying it should be council or it should be housing association.
So housing associations will be in a position to benefit from government policy and support going on?
They currently are and will continue to do so, yes.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Apart from the subsidy levels, how is the Scottish Government taking forward the recommendations that were made in the report by the Financial Capacity, Affordability and Development Subsidy Working Group?
The group is about to be reconvened to look at the other proposals, which was mainly on the sort of flexibility of the subsidy in properties where they might require to have higher than the subsidy level, and a possibility that properties could be built below the subsidy level. And it's about that flexibility to ensure that it's flexibility. We can take all of that into account, and the group will look at reconvening to discuss that. There were other areas about the timing of when payments are made to social landlords and to housing associations, and again that will be looked at. We've already made some improvements in that prior to the group being set up, but we intend to take forward the recommendations in full.
In relation to the point that was made by the convener a few minutes ago about the regional distribution of investment in housing, will that working group take into account the fact that the costs or the financial capacity may vary across different parts of Scotland?
I think when looking at the flexibility, it's the flexibility where it might cost, it's more expensive to build a house. We already have that in rural areas where the subsidy is higher in any case, but it's looking at flexibility in hard to build areas. So they will look at that when they're reconvened.
So we will avoid the scenario where we might subsidise the construction of social housing where it's cheapest to build, but unfortunately we might end up as a result of that building houses where we don't have employment prospects that we have in other parts of the country where housing is more expensive to build.
No, I mean houses are built by, the allocation goes to local authorities, and local authorities will then determine what's right for their area, so they're not going to determine what's right in a different local authority area. So I'm not sure if I'm picking you up right here.
No, I'm concerned that the priorities of government in a geographical sense may be different from the priorities of the economy. Are you reassuring me that that's not the case?
Well, what I'm saying is that it's not the government that determines where houses are built. The local authorities or they've got overall strategic view for where houses go in their area. It's distributed, the finance from the government is distributed to local authorities under an agreed formula, and the local authorities determine the number of houses, the type of houses, and where they're put in their area, whether it be housing association or any other affordable housing.
Thank you.
Do you want to say something?
Mark.
Thank you, Convener. Figures have shown that private sector house build completions have fallen over the past 9 years continuously. It's just to ask what measures the Scottish Government are taking to help that sector.
I would say a couple of things at the outset of that, and I think the first thing I would say is that there certainly is a challenge in the house building sector and the construction industry, and I wouldn't want to downplay that in any way. But given that Scotland is still outperforming the rest of the UK in its house building in terms of head of population, I think that's significant. And in social housing in particular, we're outperforming every other country in these islands. So I think, you know, it's important that we recognise that. And we're also, we look at a number of initiatives to help the house building industry. We have set up our National Housing Trust initiative. We have the My New Mortgage. We have our new supply to shared equity schemes. We have the scheme to help with infrastructure to allow developments to take place. And all of these are designed to help the industry as well. We also are, as the Deputy First Minister recently announced, £120 million towards the Help to Buy Scotland scheme, which is a scheme that was announced by the UK government, and we're looking at getting that scheme up and running hopefully very soon. We're working with stakeholders, council mortgage lenders, Homes for Scotland, the building industry, to get that scheme up and running. So we're doing a considerable amount to help the house building industry in Scotland.
That £120 million fund that you mentioned was announced in May. Just to ask if you've got any more details as to how that scheme will operate, and if you can give an indication of a timescale as to when you can announce the full details of that programme.
I think we've been working this scheme for some time, because bearing in mind that it was announced with no prior consultation with the Scottish Government, or no indication of how it could operate in Scotland, given the different systems we have. But we hope that I would think we're fairly close, are we, to having the scheme fully, and it will, you know, be announced as soon as possible. We are aware of the urgency to get this scheme up and running. We've been working hard with the Homes for Scotland and the Council of Mortgage Lenders to ensure that it is a scheme that will operate in Scotland and will work within our legal system and in our housing market. So very hope we soon that scheme will be up and running. We've already got 25 builders willing to participate in it.
And are you able to outline whether it's going to run on a similar basis to the scheme in England, or whether there's going to be a drastic change to how it's operating down south?
I think there'll be some. There are going to be some differences. Perhaps, Kay, you want to give the detail of that?
It will be as similar as we've been able to make it to the English scheme, because that's what the house building industry has told us is most helpful for them. It's also very helpful for the lenders if the two schemes are similar, because then they have to make minimum changes to their systems to accommodate the buyers who are going to come in through the programme. We're nearly there with the legal documentation. That's all been shared with the lenders and the house builders. And as the Minister says, you know, a number of the house builders have already signed formal commitments to enter into the scheme. So we're nearly there with being able to launch it so that the public can take advantage of, you know, the season over the next couple of months, which traditionally is one of the major seasons for the purchase of new homes. So, as the Minister says, we're pretty well poised and ready to go. We don't yet have a launch date to share with you, but it will be very shortly.
Okay.
Mary, did you want to come in on that?
Convener, can I just ask you a brief question around the shared equity scheme? You touched on it in your answer to Mark. Can you give me a bit more information on the uptake of the shared equity scheme and what work government is doing to promote that? And it was my understanding there was also a shared ownership scheme. If you could perhaps give me a bit of information around that. Is that still something that is actively being used? And if not, what has happened to it?
On shared equity, we could write to you with details of the take-up of our previous and our current shared equity schemes, which are a mixture of open market shared equity, where somebody buys a house or a flat on the open market, an existing house or flat, and the government takes a stake. There's a mix of those schemes and the schemes that are run with housing associations and developers for new homes. And we could give the committee a breakdown of the take-up over the last few years. The shared ownership programme we did run for a period. We evaluated all our low-cost home ownership schemes a few years back, and we looked at shared ownership, and there were some disadvantages, particularly for the buyer. So that scheme isn't available anymore, although obviously there are a number of shared owners who still retain their conditions. There were various issues in particular to do with service charges that they were liable to pay, and some difficulties in predicting what those could be, and hence what their financial commitments were.
Okay, but I'd appreciate some further information on that. Thank you, convener.
Okay, Mark, are you finished? Or? Yep. Mary, then, you've got some... Oh, sorry, Mark, you've got another question, sorry.
Yep, thanks, Convener. Previously, this committee and Audit Scotland have raised issues about the reporting of the housing budget and the transparency of that, particularly with in-year revisions and additions to the budget, and also the outcomes related to the spend in the budget. What will the Scottish Government do to improve the reporting of information relating to its housing budgets?
We have produced a detailed outturn report since 2008, but the reports haven't currently taken into account the in-year revision as you've talked about, and we're looking at doing that to be more transparent in how, if that's easier and more helpful for people. So we are looking at that. We're also, we publish the quarterly reports which identify the numbers of social rented housing, mid-market rent and affordable rent. And I think that's helpful as well and more transparent in how we're doing it. And that's in addition to what was previously done. But yes, we are looking at better reporting of the in-year revision so that it would show clearly the additions that have been made to the budget throughout the year.
And as well as reporting the in-year revisions, would you also be reporting the outcomes achieved from those revisions?
Absolutely, completions, that's
Yes.
part of what we currently report, yes.
Okay. Right, Mary, you have got some questions on the private rent sector.
Yes, thank you, convener. Minister will be aware that there is a greater reliance on the private rented sector, and I'm pleased to see that the government are taking forward a strategy for the private rented sector. Could you give me a bit more information on how you see that that strategy being taken forward, what you would like to see in it, and what input there has been from the private rented sector?
There has been a considerable input from the private rented sector in developing the strategy. We worked very closely with the private rented sector and other stakeholders to produce the strategy. And as you'll be aware that we've already taken forward some actions in terms of the tenant information pack, in terms of the tenancy deposits, and we're looking at letting agents now, regulating the letting agents industry, because we've had a lot of there was a lot of feedback that the letting industry, while it's very good in some areas, was in others were not professional about how they conducted their business, and it was bringing the whole private rented sector into disrepute. So we're very keen to look at that, and we want to ensure that customer confidence in the private sector is maintained and increased, and also to encourage growth of the private sector through investment as well, through large-scale, trying and attracting large-scale investment. We have supported Homes for Scotland in doing a piece of research and trying to get in investment into the private sector for large-scale development, which is not the majority of the private sector at present, is small landlords with one or a few properties.
When you mentioned that letting agents would regulate letting agents, how would you envisage that working?
I think, well, this is something that, as the bill comes forward, we'll be looking at and come back to committee with, but I certainly envisage it working perhaps at letting agents we're looking at accreditation, we're looking at licensing, there's a whole range of things that we're looking at with letting agents to ensure that the service that people get from a letting agent is consistent across the country and people know what to expect and know what to do if they have any issues with it.
Will there be anything in the regulation around security of tenure and long-term leases, and also protection around rent levels?
What we're doing in terms of the security of tenure and the tenure, that we're looking at that further, and the private centres, rented sector strategy group that previously set up to look at the whole private rented sector strategy has been reconvened to look at tenure. It wasn't consulted on at the outset of the bill, and won't necessarily be in the bill, but we're looking at that in more detail, and if necessary we will legislate in that as well, but that's to be discussed and consulted on yet.
And finally, can I just ask you about the tenant deposit scheme? Have all private landlords now lodged the deposits in the appropriate places? Because I know in May, I think it was only 50% of landlords had lodged deposits. So could you tell me if all deposits have been lodged, and will there be further regulation to ensure that landlords do deposit?
Well, landlords have got a legal obligation to lodge the deposit, and that's the first thing, and that's the thing that's been very clear. And what we'll be looking at and reviewing that, it is relatively new. We are looking at that, and it will be constantly reviewed, and if further regulation is required, we'll consider it. But at the moment, we're encouraging, and it's also part of the tenant information pack, it's about telling tenants as well that the landlord must lodge their deposit with one of the schemes, and so we encourage that with them. And I don't have the latest figures, but I don't know, perhaps Stephen, do you have the latest figures?
No, but we can certainly
get that.
supply
Yeah,
them.
I would appreciate that if you could get me the latest figures. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, anybody else got anything on the private rented sector? Minister, clearly the demographics in Scotland, as in other countries, is changing, and I wondered how much input as Minister you have to the whole health and social care agenda, because housing is a really important part of the health and care agenda, and whether we're building the right houses for older and more disabled people.
I think absolutely that housing is absolutely crucial to the whole agenda, as you say, Convener, of health and social care. And we're working very closely with other departments on this, and to look at this, and to have the joint improvement group looking at it as well. And certainly we've also asked the local commissioning partnerships to produce a housing contribution statement within their plans, within their commissioning plans of how they're taking things forward. So, and we all will be monitoring that and reviewing that. And I know, I do understand there is some unease that housing hasn't been given the priority it should within the housing and social care agenda, and we're working very closely to ensure it does get that priority. There's absolute recognition that it's important. And in terms of houses for varying needs, that's something that we very much support. I think in the last year there's been almost 600 houses built specifically to look at, for older persons. But certainly when I've been going around visiting housing developments, all of the new developments that I've seen, there is some or considerable thought given to who's going to live in the house now, and how that house can be used for them to remain in that house in the future. And that's very much been looked at, and I think also our increased subsidy will help that, because in some instances it costs a bit more to build a house that can be future-proofed, if that's for want of a better word. And there's a number of, I visited one very recently where you can't see it, but it's clear it's built that it's suitable to put hoists in if required later. And this is not just in houses for older people, it's getting built in houses for general housing use, but certainly for older people. It's a recognition that their needs now might not be their needs in the future, and that has to be assured that with as little disruption as possible, that house can be adapted to meet their needs. And there's a lot of good stuff going on about that just now, and certainly it's something we support, and local authorities, the strategic housing providers, are looking at that as well.
Are there some councils that are better than others, because I mean you make quite clear that it's up to the local authorities to decide their housing priorities, but it's the government that is providing the money. So is there any kind of leverage that you have with local authorities to make sure that they're building houses that can be future-proofed, not just in terms of the health and social care agenda, but in terms of the climate change agenda?
I think when we have our sustainable housing strategy, which we obviously ask local authorities to look at as well, and we'll have to meet some of the targets in that. In terms of the future-proofing of houses, when I say it's up to local authorities, but they have to take into account when they're putting their local housing strategy together, that they have looked at the needs of older people in their community. And for local authorities and house providers, it is a preventative measure, because doing it now saves them doing it in the future. And I think that's being recognised now, and it's something we're happy to promote in our discussions with local authorities. And builders are very conscious of this as well now, and have come up with some innovative ideas and how to do it, and also in terms of the costs of it as well.
Okay, and in terms of the adaptations working group's report, how is that being taken forward by the Scottish Government in conjunction with local authorities and housing associations?
Right. Well, we agreed the recommendations of the adaptations working group, which was published, I think, in December last year, and we have, after looking at it in detail, agreed the recommendations, particularly, you know, it's person-centred, it's tenure blind, and it's one single pot of money. We have, I think, recently, we have recently written to inviting people to come on to a new group to take this forward. So that's, I think, recently we wrote?
Yes, last week.
Was it just last week? We have written to people, because the previous group, they were there to put forward the recommendations. We've now written to people asking them to come on to the group to take this forward.
And have we got any way of measuring how, if a house is properly adapted, it has saved people having to move into residential care or more sheltered housing?
I think we got evidence, we've had evidence in that provided by one of the specialist housing, special needs housing associations, provided quite robust evidence in that, and I think we recognise that. I think local authorities recognise that if the adaptations are right and take into account the absolute needs of the person, then that does prevent people moving on, and it does save money in the long run.
Okay, thanks. Jim, have you got anything further to add
Yes,
on this?
thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. I was interested in what you said about the recognition of the role and importance of housing in meeting the wider integration agenda. Would you agree that it is more cost effective to make that investment as compared with the unplanned emergency admissions to hospital? This is a far more cost effective spend by government, and also one that delivers better outcomes for older people.
I think it's been agreed by government and by all of us that preventative approach is the way forward. It does have better outcomes, and in terms of housing, and we want to be absolutely clear that housing features in the housing and the health and social care agenda. I think there's a recognition by all of us that good quality housing, suitable to somebody's needs, adapted to their requirements, does prevent hospital admissions, and also prevents going into having to move and go into perhaps residential care.
Okay. In meeting the demographic challenge which the convener referred to, can you provide the committee with any specific details on the level of specialist provision that is being made available from the affordable housing budget, and specifically from the current affordable housing supply programme?
Do we have those figures in that detail? Because local authorities determine the affordable housing supply programme is the money goes to local authorities and they determine what they need. I think I said in the last year around 500, just under 600 houses were built for elderly people, and that was through part funded by the Scottish Government. Do we have the figures for other years?
That was the figure for 2012-13. We'll check if we have other years' figures and we can let the committee know.
That's helpful, as well as providing what are very useful figures on the number of homes. Would it be possible to provide a figure on the proportion of the overall housing budget that is allocated to the specialist needs of older people and disabled people? At least if I can feed in that request, I'm sure the officials will do their best to...
I mean, we can look at that. I don't know if we'd have that figure, but we can certainly look at seeing if it's possible.
Okay, thank you.
If we move on to homelessness, Adam.
Yes, good morning, Minister. There have been some really encouraging figures published recently regarding a significant fall in homeless applications to local authorities. I think it's a 13% drop from 11-12 to 12-13. And I understand you attribute this to the housing options approach and the prevention strategies that are being adopted at local level. However, there are some, in some circles, they're saying that perhaps this approach is being too robustly applied, and some people who ought to be registering as homeless are being discouraged from doing so. How would you respond to that particular charge?
I think, well, there is some anecdotal evidence from some organisations that that's the case, but we have been provided there is no evidence. We have no evidence to say that that is the case, and nobody should be prevented from making a homeless application, even if the local authority is working with them in a preventative way to look at other solutions, because the options approach is about holistic. It's a holistic approach. It's looking at the individual. It's looking at all of their needs, and it's preventative, and it's also very often about getting the situation before the homelessness actually occurs. But nobody should be prevented. I want to be very clear on that. Nobody should be prevented from making a homeless application. It is the right of people to make a homeless application. And if there is any evidence it comes to me to say that people have been prevented from making a homeless application, we'll certainly look at that quite seriously. And we still have the 2012 group that were set up, the sort of group that to monitor reaching the 2012. We maintained that group to look at how we can progress it, to ensure that we don't go back the way, and to look at any difficulties that could arise in terms of pressure on local authorities. So that group's still there, and that's certainly something that if there's evidence comes that people have been prevented from making an application, then I would certainly be asking them to look at that and look at that quite seriously.
So in terms of monitoring the housing options approach, this group that was set up to, I presume, implement the housing options approach across the country, are these the ones who are monitoring the actual practice of the approach and feeding back information to yourselves,
well,
government?
Just now, and I attend the group as well, because homelessness is something I feel very strongly about, is reducing the number of people that are homeless in our country. And therefore, you know, it's got a high priority in the group. So we're looking at every aspect of homelessness in terms of how we can ensure that where we are just now, because I don't think we should forget just where the homeless legislation in Scotland sits in terms of Europe. It's groundbreaking and well respected among other countries that are looking at us and our legislation. So I'm very keen to make sure that that continues. We have recently developed a monitoring tool for all local authorities to ensure that there's absolute clarity and uniformity in how they present their homeless statistics to us as a Scottish Government, and that will start from the 1st of April 2014, and that will be evidence-based and very robust. The monitoring group is looking at strategy and high level thing. We're looking currently just now at temporary accommodation, because there were issues raised about temporary accommodation and the condition of temporary accommodation, and they're looking at that. So every aspect of homelessness will be looked at by the group, and where changes have to be made, then we'll be looking at doing so.
Okay, that was another question I was going to ask you about temporary accommodation. I understand the use of it is overall country is decreasing, but there are some areas of the country where it's actually increasing, despite the fact that homelessness applications are reducing. Have you got any feel or understanding of what's going on there, Minister, and what we can do about that?
I think it is increasing, as you rightly say, in some areas, and I think it's increasing because more people are being assessed as being eligible for permanent accommodation, given our 2012 commitment. So yes, we are looking at that, and there are pressure in some areas. However, in other areas, who've been using the housing options approach and who have been, the preventative measures have been in place longer, are seeing a reduction in temporary accommodation. And I think as we go through and travel on, that will happen in other local authority areas as well. But we do recognise that at the moment, in some areas, because of the changes, there is an increase in temporary accommodation.
So we're talking about a work in progress then, the direction
Temporary
of travel.
accommodation is something that we'll constantly be looking at, and it is the priority just now of the 2012 group. I'm calling them the 2012 group. I know they've got a new name, but it escapes me at the moment. But that group are looking at temporary accommodation at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that, Minister. But
Just before you go on, Mary, did you have something on this particular aspect?
It's on young people and homelessness, so I don't know if you want to finish your questions and then I can...
Okay, well, clearly, the welfare reform agenda is likely to have a significant impact on the homelessness agenda, particularly with the impact of the bedroom tax and issues such as that. Well, perhaps it's not clear. Can you tell us your own view on what kind of feedback are you getting with regards to the impact of the welfare reform agenda and how that is affecting homelessness in Scotland?
At the moment, I don't want to use the word perception. At the moment, yes, we clearly are concerned about the impact of welfare reform and homelessness. It's too early yet to see if it has, because the homeless figures are still coming down, and that's what we want to see maintained. But I think we have to be aware that there could be an impact, not just of the bedroom tax, which is this sort of issue of welfare reform, but the wider welfare reform issues that are coming and have not yet been implemented by the UK government. So there are other measures that does cause me concern in terms of the impact of homelessness, and that we will be monitoring very closely to try and prevent it before it happens. But there is no direct evidence yet that there has been an impact on homelessness because of the bedroom tax or welfare reform. It's early days for that.
So in terms of mitigation, you're still sort of talking through what you can do to mitigate the impact if an impact emerges.
The Scottish Government has already put several measures in place to mitigate the impact of welfare reform, and we continue to look at measures of how we can lessen the burden on vulnerable people particularly, and vulnerable families, and we'll continue to do that. We have not given up on that, and that will continue. We'll also continue to raise this matter with the UK government at every opportunity, because we do think there's real issues with it in Scotland in terms of our housing, in terms of how it's impacting in devolved matters. Housing is devolved in Scotland, and a lot of the finance in housing comes from housing benefit, and that mismatch between the two, we are seeing how our policies have been undermined, and we'll continue to take that up with the UK government. But we're always looking at ways to mitigate the impact of welfare reform and the people of Scotland.
Okay, thank you. That's fine.
Mary.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, can I ask you a question around young people and homelessness? I mean, the Minister is aware that there is no one particular reason why people become homeless, nor is there one solution to people being homeless. but there are some quite stark and particular circumstances around young people becoming homeless. And I'm thinking specifically of young care leavers. Do the government intend doing any specific pieces of work aimed at young care leavers to prevent them becoming homeless, or indeed to give them additional support?
There's a number of measures that the government support in terms of young care leavers, and I think also in the People and Young Persons Bill, we're raising the age to 25 to make it reasonable that the government or local authorities have a right to provide care to people in up to age 25, which includes helping them into accommodation. And I think there's absolutely no doubt about it. Nobody would argue anywhere that if someone gets supported into accommodation and gets supported while they're in that accommodation, then it prevents the cycle of the homeless revolving door cycle. And that's very much in the minds of the Scottish Government and myself. And during the recess I visited a number of projects that deal with young care leavers that are supported by Scottish Government funded, supported by the third sector, working in partnership with local authorities. And that good practice, we're looking at that where there's good practice and trying to get that rolled out and extended in other areas where the practice may not be so good. But it is an absolute commitment that young care leavers are entitled to get that support and to give them the chance in life that they deserve.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, that's a very positive note to end on, unless anybody's got any other questions. Minister and officials, thank you very much for your evidence today, and thank you very much for coming. And I suspend the meeting briefly to allow current witnesses to leave the room and new ones to take their places. Thank you. Okay, if we continue, we move to agenda item 4, which is the Audit Scotland report on transport infrastructure projects. Audit Scotland published their report on infrastructure projects prior to the recess, and the Public Audit Committee, which has responsibility for consideration of Audit Scotland reports, took evidence on this report last week from the Permanent Secretary and senior Scottish Government officials, and also heard from the Auditor General herself. This committee, of course, has a close interest in the major infrastructure projects which feature in this report, and in the recommendations that improvements should be made to the public reporting of such projects. So today, can I welcome in front of the committee Caroline Gardner, the Auditor General for Scotland, Dick Gill, Portfolio Manager, Performance Audit and Best Value, Fraser McKinley, Director, Performance Audit and Best Value, and Caroline Smith, Project Manager, Performance Audit and Best Value. Gordon, would you like to start the questioning on this session, please?
Yep. Thanks very much, Convener. The Audit Scotland report highlights that most of the projects are on track to be delivered on time, and all projects are within the latest approved capital costs. It continues by stating that all 5 major projects are well managed with sound governance structures. Given that, can you clarify why the report recommends improvements to control decision-making and scrutiny of projects?
Certainly, yes. You're right that this report gives a good picture of the current status of all 5 projects. It also recognises that they are live, they're still ongoing, they're large and very complex. So there are still risks to be managed in getting them through to completion as expected, on time and on budget. And we found that for 2 projects in particular, the business cases hadn't been fully kept up to date, as there had been changes to either the scope of the project, the timescales, or the funding mechanisms that were being used. We think it's good practice to keep them up to date at major decision points, both so that there is that trail of the basis on which decisions were being made, but also so that the assurance really can be given about the affordability, the viability and the value for money of projects. That doesn't take away from the good achievements of both the Government and Transport Scotland in getting the projects to this stage, but we think it would help to manage the risks in getting them through to the final stage as planned.
Can you explain how the reporting on capital projects has improved over the last 10 years?
Yeah. Certainly, I think we see improvements at 2 levels. The first is at the overall level. It's clearly a good thing for the government to have put in place a cap for the total level of commitments which it expects to see from revenue financing of capital projects using things like NPD and the regulatory asset base for rail projects. That's a good thing. We think it would now be the next step in that to start developing reporting for the way in which commitments against that cap have been made and what the long-term consequences are. All a good step in developing transparency and clear financial reporting for the Parliament and other people with an interest. At the second level, we've seen the introduction of the government's 6 monthly reports on major capital projects coming through to the PAC and other interested parties. That, again, is a good move in transparency, but we identified through this audit work that the costs included in that report aren't always either consistent or comprehensive. For example, the cost of enabling works isn't always included in some projects, whereas it is in others, and the way in which things like inflation and contingency allowances have been included varies from project to project. We think, building on the introduction of those reports, they would be more useful to everybody who's got an interest if we can take them forward by making them more comprehensive and more consistent so that everybody knows what's in and what's not.
You said about the introduction of these 6 monthly reports. When were they introduced, and what was the scenario prior to them being introduced in terms of reporting to Parliament?
I'm not sure if I've got a date, but Dick will be able to help me with that in a moment, I think. Before that, there was really not very much transparency about reporting to Parliament. I think it's an area which has developed since the Parliament was established in 1999. As people's interest has grown, as the importance of that transparency has become clearer, and as the complexity of capital financing has increased with the use of different vehicles for financing capital rather than just the capital allocations within the Scottish bloc. Dick, can you help with the date of the introduction of this?
The Scottish Government started its 6 monthly reporting to the Public Audit Committee in I think it was mid-2009, certainly in 2009, and that followed a report that the Auditor General presented the previous, I think it was December 2008, something like that, on major capital projects, which was our first review of, a comprehensive review of major capital investment in the health and central government sectors, and that identified a shortfall in public information about these large and important projects. I think the Scottish Government fully accepted that there was scope to improve. That's why they introduced the 6-monthly project reporting. And I think Peter Housden at the Public Audit Committee last week acknowledged that had been a kind of step change for the government, and they were seeking to build on that strong foundation.
To be clear, are you saying that for the first 10 years there was no reporting to committees on capital projects?
There wasn't systematic reporting in the sense that the 6-monthly report identifies every project in the central government and health sectors that's expected to cost more than £50 million. There was, of course, previously ad hoc reporting on individual projects, and individual projects would have been subject to legislation, for example, so there have been reporting about that, but there wasn't systematic and consistent reporting.
Right. Now, the 5 projects that the report looks at are only partially completed, and, for example, in the case of AWPR, is at a very early stage. Has it always been the practice for Audit Scotland to look at projects at this very early stage and examine them, or is this the first?
It's a really good question. I think that there's an assumption that audit is always sort of retrospective, that it's always coming along at the end of the financial year and looking back at the accounts for that financial year. And to a great extent, that's true. That's a big part of our work. But there also is a long record of us doing work which is looking ahead at the way policy is being implemented, particularly for big and complex investments like this, where it's not very much help to come along afterwards and point out where things could have been done better. It's much more helpful to be looking at the progress that's being made with the aim of making a constructive contribution and identifying things that could either help with these particular projects or could be a contribution to the management of the capital programme in future.
Okay, thanks so much.
You highlighted more issues relating to Transport Scotland's management of rail projects than road projects. I wonder what the reason for this is. I mean, is it that there are more fundamental concerns about Transport Scotland's management of rail projects? Is it because Transport Scotland are not directly doing it like Fourth Replacement Crossing, but they obviously have to work with the UK body, which is Network Rail? What was the reason for highlighting rail projects more than road projects?
There's at least a couple of reasons, and I'll ask colleagues to come in after me to amplify what I'm about to say. At the high level, I think one reason is that it is more complicated to do some of this through the regulatory asset base than through either direct funding, as with the Fourth Replacement Crossing, or through NPD, which is being used for the road projects. As you say, Network Rail is part of that. There are different requirements, and that brings its own challenges in terms of making sure that all the information is available for good decision making. The second is that particularly for the Edinburgh-Glasgow improvement package, there was a late decision to reduce the scope of the projects, the improvements that were required, to make them affordable within the funding that was available. And that obviously brings with it its own risks in terms of making sure that what's planned in future is both affordable but is also achievable, it's sustainable and so on. So that's the second reason for bringing it in. Dick, Fraser, would either of you like to add to that?
I think the only thing I'd want to say is that strategic oversight of railway investment is in the kind of the history of things. It's a relatively new responsibility for Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government. I think one of the reasons for setting up Transport Scotland in 2006 was to give a more stronger control and strategic oversight of railway investment. There's a very long-established track record for the government supervising and controlling roads projects. That's been done for many, many years in Scotland, but rail is a relatively new area. So as Caroline's and of course the decision-making framework is quite special within the railway sector because of the role of Network Rail and the role of the Office for Rail Regulation, the regulator. I'm not sure I'd want to offer much more comment than that at this stage, Convener.
Are you saying that because there are all these other bodies involved, it's much more difficult to get a clearer picture?
I'm not sure that it's more difficult. I think it's simply it's a different environment in which Transport Scotland are operating within. It's a more complex environment, perhaps.
Okay, and Mr. McKinnon? No, thank you. Your report also states that annual payments for road projects funded through the NPD model and rail projects funded through RAB are not made public during the earlier approvals phases of the project. Why do you consider this to be an issue, and how do you think it might be resolved?
As I said in my answer to an earlier question, we think it's a good thing that the government has set a cap for the amount of long-term revenue commitments that it wants to enter into for capital investment. That has to be a good thing to make sure that those commitments are affordable. The next step in that is obviously to develop a mechanism for reporting what the cap is, and it will change over time because it's set as a percentage of the departmental expenditure limits, and to report what the commitments are against it. We recognise that there are some sensitivities in doing that. For example, it wouldn't be sensible for the government to be publishing its estimates of the cost of a large project before it was committed at contract stage, because it would weaken its position with bidders and tenderers as it was negotiating those costs. And we've therefore suggested that it should explore that public reporting in terms of either portfolios or groups of projects like roads and schools and so on. But we do think that's the next stage in really making the setting of the cap, which is a good first step, valuable in practice in demonstrating how much commitment has been made against it and how much headroom there is for future investment.
Okay, Mark, did you have a point on this?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I can understand why there would be no public reporting at an early stage associated with MPD. I struggle to see why it's commercially sensitive for RAB borrowing. Could you perhaps just go into detail as to why the RAB side is commercially sensitive too?
I'll ask Dick to follow up because he knows much more about this than I do. But I think that you're right, the issues are different for NPD and for RAB. For NPD, it is about the commercial sensitivity. For RAB, I suspect it's more about the uncertainty until an agreement is reached. But I'll ask Dick to pick that point up.
I think there is a commercial dimension to the RAB-funded projects because Network Rail is an independent entity. It's a commercial arrangement between Transport Scotland and Network Rail, so there is a commercial tension there. I think that I think conventionally a lot of people have said you can't release this information because it is commercially sensitive, and I think our view on that is there's room for the public sector to be more to be smarter about these issues. So one of the recommendations we've made in our report was that reporting of costs might be made on a portfolio level rather than a project level, which would take a lot of the commercial sensitivity, to the extent that it exists, out of the situation. And we do think that being clear about the real public sector costs in the long term are very important for all stakeholders who are looking at these projects.
Okay, so it's your understanding for RAB borrowing, it will be a commercial agreement between Network Rail and the government, and that there will be variations in levels of interest charged for different projects?
Do you want to take that?
I'll take that question. There is like a standard rate in terms of for the rail projects, which is agreed with the regulator. But once a project's scoped up, the regulator actually has to assess the costs of the project, and Transport Scotland will specify what they want. Network Rail will prepare cost estimates based on that, and the role of the regulator is to identify whether those costs and assess whether those costs are reasonable for that project. And there could be some negotiation within that process. There is another aspect of commercial sensitivity for the RAB ones, and it's because Network Rail won't build the projects, they will contract with other bodies, so that relationship can be commercially sensitive. And for the Borders Railway, although the main contract was let and agreed for the cost of the project, there had still to be quite some of the subcontracts, so there were still commercial sensitivities at the stage that we reported.
Mary?
Thank you, Convener. The report highlights a number of concerns about Transport Scotland's business case development and assurance procedures. Has any assessment been done on the impact or the cost implications of Transport Scotland not meeting best practice? And what guidance has been given around how best practice should and could be achieved with both Transport Scotland, and what should the government be doing to make sure that compliance is met?
I think it's worth saying that overall we found that all the projects are being well managed given their current state of development, and the governance arrangements for 2 of the projects are sound and properly in place. For the other 2, the 2 rail projects, they're still in development because of changes to either the scope of the project or the way it's being financed. And it was those 2 where we recommended that business cases should be kept up to date so that they're available at key decision-making points. There is a wide range of guidance available from the Scottish Government and from Treasury, and I'll ask Dick and Carolyn to take you through that if I may. Carolyn, can you just outline the guidance that's available from Treasury and from the Scottish Government about business cases and project management?
Yes, the Treasury published guidance on preparing business cases, and it's mandatory that all public bodies follow that guidance. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. It's Green Book guidance, and it sets out various. There is a 5-stage process of developing business cases. There's a strategic business case, outline business case, full business case, and there are various assurance processes within that. On top of the Treasury guidance, the Scottish Government has got its own guidance as well on investing and decision-making for major projects, which is in line with the Treasury guidance. And on top of that, Transport Scotland has its own guidance as well on preparing business cases. Now, they're all aligned to the Treasury guidance, so that there is guidance on what should be included in the business case in terms of demonstrating value for money, affordability and viability of projects at the various different stages and approvals points. So that guidance is out there, and it was, in general, we found in place for all of the projects, apart from the approval process, updating the business cases for the 2 rail projects at key points.
And the guidance, does each set of guidance contain guidance on different things?
There are.
And is that one of the problems? We're almost at a point where there's guidance about guidance.
I think there is, as Carolyn has explained, there are different types of guidance. I think the differences are essentially about specific local circumstances. So the Treasury guidance is for the whole UK public sector. The Scottish Government guidance is obviously deals with some specific Scottish requirements. There's a broader point that I think is worth drawing out for the committee, which is, I think Audit Scotland over the years has been reinforcing the importance of clear business cases as the basis for investment decisions, because we think that helps decision makers make good decisions, which is in the public interest. And I think that when we first reported on major projects back in 2008, I think as it were, the culture of business cases was less developed in the public sector than it now is. I think there's been quite a shift, including, I would say, within Transport Scotland, towards developing a business case as a tool to assist decision making. I think what we now see as good practice in relation to business cases is that it's a tool that is continuously updated through the life of a project, so that as circumstances change, you continually review whether the project continues to make sense and to provide value for money. And I think the shortcomings that we identified, or the gaps that we identified in relation to the 2 railway projects, for example, was it wasn't that they didn't have a business case, it's that Transport Scotland wasn't keeping it fully up to date, and yet it was making some very important decisions about those 2 projects, which, in our judgment, necessitated a revisit of the business case. Simply on grounds of prudence and good decision making, circumstances have changed. Does it still make sense to proceed with this project in this way, using this delivery route, and so on and so forth?
So are you confident that the circumstances that you've talked about may not happen again, and that there is more awareness of constantly reviewing a process as you go through it?
Well, I think that this is quite subjective, but my belief is that Transport Scotland, I think they think business cases are an extremely important part of the process. I think we perhaps had a slightly different view from them about how regularly those business cases needed to be reviewed. And our judgment was that at times, such as in the example of the Borders Railway, where the procurement route had to be changed because the NPD route didn't work, our judgment was it was appropriate at that stage when you were changing your fundamental, the way you were procuring that project, it made sense, or it would have made sense to look again at all of the basics around the project. And Transport Scotland had a slightly different view, that their view was that we were continuing to develop the project and that we would, in due course, look at the proper business case when at a later stage. So it's a question of degree rather than a fundamental gap in some areas.
So do you think there are further steps that need to be taken to ensure best practice?
Yes, we've made some recommendations about that. For example, one of our recommendations is about scheduling decision-making across government. It's a recommendation. It's the second recommendation on page 8. We say by December 2013, the Scottish Government should refine and develop its plan for scrutinising, challenging and monitoring major investment projects. And that's about scheduling decision-making so that there are no surprises about when projects reach key stages, about integrating individual project decisions with wider decisions, such as the overall railway investment programme. Some wider decisions have to be made about that. So it's about integrating and smarter decision-making within government.
Thank you, Convener. I was just going to make a similar point to the one that Dick made towards the end there, which is December of this year is a really important point for us in all of this. You'll see in the recommendations, as Dick's just mentioned, that there are a number of those that we would expect to have seen progress on by the end of this calendar year, including the first one there for Transport Scotland to look at how they do business case development and the assurance processes around that. So I don't think we're necessarily at a stage sitting today of saying that they will or they won't have done it. They certainly have committed to reviewing the things that we've highlighted in here, and we'll obviously be keeping a very close eye on progress towards the end of the year and into early 2014.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
But there isn't any indication in what you've said so far in this committee and previous committees that there is anything particular to worry about.
We don't think that the gaps that we've seen in relation to the two rail projects have had any significant impact on the decision-making or the progress of them. We do think, though, that for both of them, given the significant changes that were made either to scope or to the financing method quite late on in them, it would be very good practice and good risk management for Transport Scotland and the government to make sure it's got all of that information in one place to be able to step back and take a decision about affordability, viability, value for money before making significant decisions like that. And that's why we've made the recommendation that we have.
If we look at specific projects then, Alex, do you want to look at the Forth Replacement Crossing?
Thank you, Convener.
Or the Queensferry Crossing, as you call it now.
Turning to the Forth Replacement Crossing, in your report you say that the project is on track to complete within the latest cost estimate and on or ahead of schedule. Of course, yesterday we saw a further reduction in the estimated outturn cost. Would that view contained within the report continue to be your view given the further reduction in outturn cost estimate?
The costs for the Forth Replacement Crossing have always been expressed within a range of estimates, and the government so far has been successful in keeping the costs within that range as the contract was let and as work has been carried out, with the most risky part of the work heading for completion now. So what we're seeing, I think, is within that range of estimates, and is obviously good news in releasing resources that can be used to fund other projects in future.
When the project was first discussed and when values were first, or costs were first put on the project, the figures were extremely high, high enough to provoke debate in committee and in Parliament about why it would be so expensive to do this project compared with other projects in other parts of the world. Do you think these original figures were truly robust, or were they simply overestimates to make the figures look good in the long term?
I think this is a classic example of the way in which the estimated costs for a project become more accurate over time as there's greater clarity about what the project is, how it will be constructed and how it will be financed. I'll ask Dick and Carolyn to talk you through the history of those estimates in broad terms, just to give you a feel for the reasons why they've shifted so significantly over time.
Okay, we do comments in paragraph 21 of the report about the changing scope of the Forth replacement crossing, or the Queensferry crossing as it's now known, I think. The essential difference, I think, was that when the higher estimates, they were over 3 billion, I can't remember the exact figure right now, when those estimates were prepared, the expectation was that the existing crossing, it would be impossible to maintain that safely. It would have to close, and therefore the replacement bridge would be an entire replacement. I think since then the engineers have had another look at the cables that are holding the bridge up, and they've taken a less pessimistic view, and that resulted in essentially advice to the Scottish Government that it would be feasible to continue to use the existing bridge on a limited basis. And so the Forth replacement crossing project, as we understand it now, is essentially two bridges, which is maintaining the existing bridge to be used principally, I think, for public transport, and building a new bridge to be used for private cars and goods vehicles. The decision to, as it were, continue to use the existing bridge meant that the scope of the new bridge could be significantly reduced. It's a smaller bridge than it would otherwise have had to be. And our understanding is that that explains the significant fall in the estimated costs. I think there are possibly some other technical factors in there, that changes in the treatment of cost of capital is an element, for example. But I think there is a very significant change in scope of the project, and that explains or that helps to explain the large reduction in costs. Could I just also make the very brief point that the original estimate may have been on the high side, but it's probably in the public interest that a full estimate of cost is provided, even if it does prove to be rather high, then a very low estimate is provided, because historically I think low estimates have been associated with getting projects through that have then subsequently proved to be a lot more expensive, and we've certainly got some examples of that in Scotland. And I think the government is very risk averse in that area, and I think it's wise to look at high costs rather than low costs.
Sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of the very initial estimate, it was like in the region of 3.2 billion to 4.2. It was a completely different project, so we didn't actually look at the robustness of those cost estimates as part of this audit. The scope had changed to such an extent that there was no value in us looking at that original estimate. So our baseline for looking at this, we reported it just so that we could be clear and transparent about how the costs have moved and the reasons for that. But we looked at it from the point where the full business case was approved, which gave the range of 1.4 billion to 1.6. And the announcement recently for the savings of 145 million, that's close to what we actually reported where was potential savings within the report. In our Exhibit 4 on page 20, we identified a potential saving of 151 million, which is very close to the 145 million.
So would it be fair to say then that the announcement that was made yesterday is simply an indication that the project's being carried forward efficiently and effectively?
I think that is fair, and it's clearly good news for all of us. It does, as I say, release funds that can be used now to invest in other capital priorities.
So would it, in general terms, would it be fair to say that this project, given its performance, is something of an exemplar as to how such projects should be carried out in Scotland?
It's always nice for us to be able to report good news coming out of our audit work, and the Forth replacement crossing clearly is being well managed within the business case that was approved by Parliament.
Your report states that the Scottish Government publicly reported the estimated increase in the operating and maintenance costs of the fourth replacement crossing, but excluded the risk and optimism bias. What might this mean in practice?
I think in practice it doesn't have very much meaning on its own. I think the point that we want to emphasise is the bigger one, that when the Government and Transport Scotland are reporting progress of major investment projects like this, it's very important that the costs are comprehensive and that they're consistent between different projects. The way in which things like enabling works, the acquisition of land and so on are treated can vary between different reports, and particularly things like inflation, optimism bias, contingency allowances are sometimes included and sometimes excluded. And we think it's much better both for accountability for the money that's being spent, but also for decision-making purposes if that information is reported clearly and consistently. The report recommended that the Scottish Government should work with the Parliament, the Public Audit Committee, this committee and the Finance Committee to draw up a template for how that reporting might look in future and what level of projects should be included to make sure you're not swamped by detailed information that you can't make use of. And I'm pleased that the Government's accepted that recommendation and will be working with the Scottish Government people and the clerks of the Audit Committee, Public Audit Committee to do that. This committee may want to consider if it wants to contribute to that thinking to make sure that the information that's produced in future meets your needs as well.
Thank you.
I should say at this juncture that we do have a 6-monthly briefing on the progress from the team, the FRC team, and I think they get fairly robust questioning when they're in front of us. Are you finished? Yeah. Okay, Gordon and then Mary.
Yeah, I'm okay, my point's been covered.
Okay, Mary? No? All right. Okay, if we move on to Egypt, Mark.
Thank you, Camilla. Just to ask Auditor General if you're confident that phase 1 of the Egypt project can be delivered on time and on budget, especially given the uncertainty around changes to the project and the fact that we're still awaiting a full business case?
As I said in my answer to an earlier question, all of these projects are live and large and complex, and that means it's impossible for us to give full assurance that they will be delivered on time and on budget. I think the report makes it clear that some of the questions about the Egypt project are still more open than they are about other projects because of the recent shift in the cost and therefore the scope of the project that we've seen to make sure that it's affordable. That's why we've recommended that Transport Scotland needs to update the business case and make sure it's kept up to date, and why we think that the public reporting to this committee, to the Public Audit Committee and elsewhere needs to be consistent and comprehensive so that you have that assurance. At this stage, we don't have any reason to expect or to foresee that it's going off track, but I think it is fair to say there are more significant risks associated with this project than with the others covered by the report.
For that, Transport Scotland initially set a completion date for this project of December 2016. Within your report, you have stated that they now expect to realise the full benefits planned for Egypt Phase 1 by March 2019. I wonder if you're able to give me the source, who it was that informed you that that project was delayed from December 2016 to March 2019.
I'll ask Dick and Carolyn to take you through the source of the information reported on that one.
The 2016 date was the date for the initial larger scale Egypt project that was set at the time of the business case. So that was back, and Exhibit 4 actually gives details of when that, I think it was 2011 December, the business case for Egypt that approved the 2016 delivery date at the 1.1 billion cost. After that, the project changed substantially, reducing the cost to 650 million, so it was a different type of project that was being delivered again. So they had to go back and start rephasing, looking at what was possible to deliver within 650 million. While we were doing the work, it still wasn't entirely clear what the new scope of Egypt was. So in terms of they were working to what needs to be within this Egypt delivery phase 1 and what can be done later. For Egypt phase 1, which is completely different from the first phase, some of the work they weren't able to do until 2019, and part of that was because what's the Glasgow station called? Queen Street Station had to be remodelled to allow the new trains to come in for extending the platform. So they had to rephase part of that, so that couldn't be achieved until late 2018, so they couldn't get the full carriages in. So in terms of phase 1 benefits, increasing capacity and having more regular trains, we weren't able to get the new trains in until December 2018, I think it was, so which meant 2019 for realising the benefits.
Just to be clear, the source for the information is Transport Scotland. You know, we've confirmed the factual accuracy of the report with Transport Scotland, so there's no doubt in our mind about the March 2019 date. That was the best estimate available at the time, and I think it would be recognised by Transport Scotland.
Do you know if Parliament has been made aware of that change?
I believe there was a statement in earlier.
It was in the latest Public Audit Committee 6-monthly update of the 2019 date.
Okay, so it was within the government's 6-monthly update. Okay. Then in your report as well, you say that the full business case is expected to be completed by the end of May 2013, and after which ministers will approve scope, cost and time targets. Do you know if that has been completed as yet?
Visited since the report was completed and published. It's not something that came up in the evidence that was given to the Public Audit Committee last week, so we don't have any more formal information about that, but we can provide to the committee at this point.
Okay. Are there any key milestones on the Egypt project that you feel the committee should be made aware of to allow us to track the progress of the project?
In a sense, that's one of the things that we would very much expect to see in the updated business case. The business case is the opportunity to pull together all of the planning for construction, other work that needs to be done to bring it to completion. And that's the source for Transport Scotland, the government and the Parliament to identify the milestones for reviewing progress and working it through. It's one of the reasons why we think it's so important, and we will be keeping it under review as part of our ongoing audit work. Fraser.
At a high level, Mr Griffin, in the recommendations we set out in the second last bullet point on page 9, the kind of thing that we would expect to see reported on the individual projects, and again that's a recommendation with a date on it of December 2013. So I think, as Caroline says, the discussions that are ongoing hopefully will flesh out what the appropriate milestones are and how exactly they're going to be reported to Parliament.
So in your mind, the full business case of us is of utmost importance to allow this committee, Parliament and Audit Committee to scrutinise the Egypt project to make sure that that's on track, on time and on budget.
Up-to-date business cases are a very important part of the governance of any major project like this, because they do let you pull together the whole picture into one place. That's why we've recommended that it should be updated, and why Transport Scotland is committed to doing that. As Fraser said, there's a higher level discussion going on about the information that the Parliament and its committee need to be able to monitor progress, and that's still underway. It's really just last week that the Government and Transport Scotland gave evidence to the Public Audit Committee, but by the end of this year we would expect to see that clear plan of how it will be reported to the Parliament, so that you can play your proper role in overseeing progress.
Okay. If we move on to the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, which is of major importance to at least 2 people on this committee, your report highlights the fact that government arrangements for the EWPR scheme are currently being revised. Are you satisfied that this will not adversely impact on the delivery of the project?
I think it's clear that this is a project that's had a difficult history until very recently, for a range of reasons to do with the planning system and so on.
I think it's more legal wrangling rather than planning, but on you go.
Well put, convener, thank you. The assurance we were able to take at the point we did our audit work was that the project had reached a stage where it was possible to plan for completion, and the governance arrangements that Transport Scotland had in place were good and effective. That's clearly not to say that things can't go wrong. They can with any major project, but we didn't highlight any concerns at that point about the likelihood of it reaching completion on cost and on time.
I mean, this is still a project that's very much in its early stages compared to some of the other projects we're discussing today. You know, given your report, you know, is it good to say that these things are going to happen because it's at that very early stage? I mean, would normally Audit Scotland really look at a project like this at this very early stage?
We have in the past looked at major projects which are underway, as I said before, because it's more useful to come in and look at the governance arrangements, look at the way in which they're being managed, look at the extent to which the planning for the future is robust and stands up to scrutiny. You're right that the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route is at a fairly early stage, but our conclusion was that the governance arrangements are effective, they're in place, and that there is no reason to be more concerned than with any other large project about the way this one will move towards completion. That's absolutely not to say things can't go wrong, but we didn't highlight any specific concerns about the way it's being managed. I can see Dick would like to add to that.
Yeah, before you come in, Dick, you know, are you saying that in terms of public money and taxpayers' money, the bundling of the AWPR with the Balmedy-Tipperty was a good idea, and the government's arrangements over the two projects coming together has been satisfactory in your eyes?
That's a good question. With all 5 projects, what we haven't done at this point is to step back and examine the business cases for the investment that's being made overall. Our focus was very specifically on the way in which they're being managed to bring them in on cost and on budget against the current estimates as we get to. We haven't therefore examined the decision to bundle the 2 projects together. We started with the commitment to invest in that combined project and to look at the way it's being managed. Dick may be able to shine a bit of extra light on that, I think.
Just to say that I don't think we haven't sought to examine the rationale, you know, why it's a good use of public money, because we regard that as very much something that ministers ultimately are responsible for. We've looked around controls and decision making to make sure that it's a well managed and sound project. I think in the case of the AWPR, I think we've no reason to challenge the bundling that's taken place. My understanding is that makes sense because it means the government can include a project, the Balmedy-Tipperty works, that it otherwise would be struggling to afford within its capital budget by including it as an MPD project. I think that's the rationale for that. Could I just make a broader point, if you'll allow me, Convener, which is we see part of the value of reports like this as providing assurance. We don't report by exception. We don't report where things are going wrong. We think it's very much in the public interest to report to the Parliament if we think these very large projects are progressing successfully, and in the main, that's the conclusion we've drawn about most of these projects. So I think there's no expectation that we're seeking to criticise these projects. It's more about they're very large and important projects. These are very important for people who live in Scotland, for taxpayers and for MSPs, and it's important you have good information about how they're getting on, and if they're going well, then we think that's important information.
And in terms of the business case, I think there are thousands and thousands of commuters in the North East who will tell you about the business case.
Yes, I'm sure.
Alex?
Yes, I could raise this point in relation to other projects, but I'm going to raise it in relation to this and in more general terms, and that is the non-profit distributing finance model. You've expressed in your report concerns about the risks associated with NPD finance being higher in the current financial climate. And you've also expressed concern about no public reporting of the 30 years costs associated with NPD procurement models. Is there anything that needs to be said at this stage about the NPD funding model and whether that needs to be refined, honed or developed further until we can be confident it will work for these types of projects?
I think there are two separate points in your question. The first about the NPD model itself. I think it's important to be very clear that there is nothing wrong with financing capital investment through a revenue financing model, whether it be NPD, PFI, the regulatory asset base, or some other way of doing it. We all do it when we buy a home on a mortgage, and it's a way of spreading the cost over a long period, particularly in a time when strict capital resources are constrained and the government is keen to get both the infrastructure boost and the boost to the economy from the construction work going on. So there's no criticism about that in itself. There's a separate question about the NPD model itself, and we don't so much express concerns about that model as say that in the current climate it has been more challenging to find bidders who are willing to take on the projects that are available, and we've seen that particularly with the Borders Railway over the last couple of years, and that obviously brings with it a risk that costs will be higher than they would be in a different economic and commercial environment. What we haven't done in this report is to evaluate the different models of private financing, and that's not its purpose. What we are saying though is that when capital investment is being funded through revenue models, it is very important that there's transparency about what commitments that is binding the government to over the 30-year period that they take. As I said earlier, I think setting the cap was a very good move by the government in being clear about what they think is affordable to finance through these methods. The next step is clearly to develop a method for reporting what the cap is and how much of it is committed over a rolling 30-year window to make sure that that is transparent to the Parliament and that people know how much headroom there is for future decision making in the years to come.
Thank you.
Move on to the M8 bundle. Adam.
Okay, as you indicated, your report is broadly positive about the development of the M8 bundle projects to date. Would you care to highlight any key milestones that we should be looking out for as a committee in terms of scrutiny of this particular project?
In general terms, I think the business case for any project should be setting those key milestones, and they clearly come at the points where a contract is let, where significant construction is complete, where the allowances for inflation and contingency and risk can be released or not, depending on progress coming through. I'll ask Dick to pick up any more specific points about this bundle of projects, if I may.
As we highlighted in the report, one of the main risks around this project is an NPD finance project, and as we've been saying earlier, the market for private finance has been difficult in recent years because of the financial crisis and so on and so forth. When we completed our work, I think we basically stopped our examination in May of this year. At that stage, that project was with the market, bids had been invited, but several bidders were in contention, and the biggest risk was around whether any of those bidders would be able to come up with an affordable and basically viable financing package. So my understanding is that I think Transport Scotland announced a few weeks ago that they have now moved to the preferred bidder stage, which means they have selected a bidder, and presumably they've done so on the basis that that bidder has provided a viable financing package, although we haven't examined that and I don't have any information about that. So that's quite an important milestone that they've reached. The key milestone will be it's an obvious one, but the contract award point, because at that point they will have certainty about the financing costs, which are a risk for this project, and I'm afraid I can't recall the exact timetable for that. I think that is I'm sorry, I think I'd mislead the committee if I gave you a date. I can't recall the date. It's towards the end of this year, as I understand it, but I can't remember the precise date. I'm afraid we can let you have a note if it's helpful.
Talking about NPD, if I can highlight the Borders Railway project, could you tell us what impact switching from NPD to RAB funding has had on the delivery of this particular project?
In terms of the cost of the project, at this stage not, because we're still in the process of finalising exactly what the arrangements will be for it. It obviously, though, has had an impact on the timescale for the project, because the original procurement that was intended to go through NPD wasn't successful due to the commercial environment, and that has led to extra time being needed to move through the regulatory asset-based funding model and get the work in progress from there. So an impact on the timescale, too soon to say what the impact is on the cost, I think.
Okay. And what about lessons to be learned in terms of you mentioned the M8 bundle had obviously attracted a number of interested parties, but we only had one competent NPD bid here. Is there any particular lesson to be learned from that?
Yes, I'll ask Dick to come in a moment, but I think you're absolutely right that one of the things we think this report can help to do, part of its value, is really in providing a basis for learning lessons for the projects we're talking about here for the future, and more importantly for the wider pipeline of projects. Given the amount of money we're talking about, that's critical. Dick, I think, can talk you through some of the specifics of those two as comparators.
I'm not sure, lessons learned I'm a bit cautious about, but when we discussed this issue with Transport Scotland, certainly their view was that one of the factors leading to not being able to progress the Borders Railway as an NPD project was because it was a railway project, and because NPD and indeed private finance initiative finance for railway projects it's novel. I'm not sure that it's been done. If it has been done, it's quite rare. Whereas in the road sector, private finance and NPD finance projects are, well, certainly private finance projects are much commoner, and the market is familiar with them. They're comfortable with providing them. There's a track record there. So I think the lesson for Transport Scotland was about whether this particular project was really suitable for this form of procurement as a railway project. I may be wrong on this, but I'm not aware that they're advancing any other railway projects as NPD finance. Mm-hmm. And we do have some information about the financial impacts of the move from PFI to RAB. So certainly the financing of the project is Network Rail have a lower financing rate than your typical NPD provider. So it's quite a significant saving in terms of the long-run cost, because the financing charge that Network Rail will levy is significantly lower than might otherwise be expected. I think there were also quite fundamental change, or some important changes at least, in how Network Rail proposed to strike a balance between investment now and future maintenance costs. And I think one of the large changes that Network Rail made was they proposed a more capital intensive project which they thought would provide better value for money in the long term through savings in long term maintenance. But Transport Scotland would really have to give you the detail on that. There were some quite significant changes at the time. It wasn't just a question of switching method of procurement, it was wider than that, I think.
Okay. So it begs the question why you would even consider an NPD for a railway project and not do the RAB fund, go down the RAB funding route. Was there a logic to that, an initial decision?
I'm not sure I can offer much insight into that.
I think it would have to be a question for the Scottish Government and Transport Scotland rather than for us.
Well, the one thing I could offer, I do believe that Transport Scotland or the Scottish Government have become increasingly interested in the concept of regulated asset-based finance. And of course the original decision to procure Borders Railway as an NPD project, I'm can't remember the dates, but that would have been 2010 or even earlier than that. And I think possibly the Scottish Government has seen the scope for including more projects in regulated asset base than perhaps it anticipated when it was making decisions around the Borders Railway. Again, I am speculating a little bit there, so I'd be cautious about taking that as necessarily the right answer.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, Jim?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. We've covered a lot of ground this morning, so I just have a number of final questions for completeness. In your earlier evidence, Ms Gardner and Mr Gill, you indicated that a new 6-month reporting mechanism had been put in place for major transport infrastructure projects, and that represented an improvement on previous practice. Can I ask you about another innovation, which is the establishment by the Scottish Government of the Infrastructure Investment Board? Can you tell us in what way this has strengthened the scrutiny of high-value projects?
We say in the report that we think the introduction of the board was a good thing, was a very helpful way for the Scottish Government to be able to keep a strategic overview of its investment in significant infrastructure. And we also make the point that it sort of came in the middle for a number of major projects, so the extent to which it could play the full role that's envisaged for it varied depending on the state of play for each project at the point where it came into being. We make some recommendations about integrating the work of the Infrastructure Investment Board with other decision-making and reporting processes that are in place that we think will help to make it more useful again. I think that it's a really helpful focus for some of the recommendations we've made about reporting against the revenue consequences of capital investment decisions and for reporting on the performance in cost and time of individual projects. But in general terms, yes, we think it's a good innovation, and a few more tweaks can help to fulfil its full potential in doing that.
Okay, I just thought it was useful to have that on the record. Can I ask you about the other recommendation in your, about the recommendation in your report in order to promote openness and public accountability, and that is that the Scottish Government should consult with this committee and other committees on the threshold value for the routine public reporting of major projects. Can you explain what the benefit of that would be? And also, do you have any view at this stage as to what the threshold value should be set at?
Sure. The point of that part of the recommendation is that there's obviously a balance to be struck between giving you information that's full and comprehensive and giving you so much information about so many projects, some of them small, that it's very difficult to step back and see the wood for the trees. We have got different thresholds in operation for different types of reporting at the moment. The figure of 20 million for a project is one that has been in discussion around some of this, but this committee, the Public Audit Committee and the Finance Committee, I think should all have the chance to say what the threshold would be, below which you would find the information too detailed and above which you'd find it simply at too high a level of aggregation to be useful to you.
Can I encourage you to give us a figure? I mean,
Yeah.
Sir Peter Housden gave evidence to the Public Audit Committee last week. He did make reference to two figures. The figure of 50 million in terms of what is reported on a 6-monthly basis, and also the suggestion that there might be, they already provide information on the web for projects of over 20 million. So have you got any figure in mind?
Yes, and I'll ask Dick to come in a moment. We're really not trying to obfuscate this. What we're saying is that there's lots of information out there already, and what's really important is to pull that together into one place so that it's available to this committee, other committees of the Parliament, and anyone with an interest. Dick will talk you through the different figures that have been in discussion and where we think we may come down in relation to that.
We don't necessarily have a view about whether it should be 50 or whether it should be 20. I think our view is that there should be clarity around this, and it's not, in our view, it's not terribly helpful to have different reports at different levels because you get different populations of projects. I think our general thinking around this is that there's an opportunity for the Parliament to receive, for the Scottish Government to provide slightly more strategic information. The PAC receives a regular 6-monthly report on all projects over £50 million, and there's a lot of detail about those individual projects, but it's quite hard to get the big picture. At the same time, the Scottish Government is publishing other information which we know is, which stakeholders find interesting, about its future pipeline of investment projects, for example, where it set a threshold of 20 million. I think our view is that the Parliament would benefit from getting more strategic and complete information, and that might involve a threshold of 20 million, which would give you, more comprehensive information. But we are nervous about the Parliament being overloaded or bombarded with a lot of project-specific information. So whatever threshold is set, careful consideration needs to be given to the form of reporting and what information and data that you as stakeholders would find most useful. And we think there's an opportunity for smarter summarisation, clearer exception reporting, those sorts of issues, which doesn't really feature in current reporting.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for your consideration of MSP's workload. I've got one final question, Convener, if I can beg your indulgence, and that is the issue that my colleague, Mr Johnson, mentioned about the 30-year costs associated with projects that are funded either through NPD or RAB. You mentioned this specifically in your report, and the fact that for these larger projects which have a total estimated spending commitment over 30 years of in excess of £5 billion, that we don't currently have any public reporting on these. Do you have any suggestions on how this situation could be improved?
I think the principle has been accepted by government that there should be reporting now against the cap, having taken the very positive step of setting it. There's now the need to develop clarity about what the cap itself looks like over time and what's been committed against it, both with projects that are already under contract and those that are in the pipeline and well under development. I don't think it is our place to say how it could be done. We've tried to set out some principles in the report. And in his evidence to the Public Audit Committee last week, the Permanent Secretary said that the Cabinet Secretary may well be addressing that in his statement on the budget this afternoon. We'll obviously look closely at the format that the government proposes, but I think it's for government to be proposing that form of reporting. And if we feel there's room for further development, then certainly we'll report on that.
We'll certainly await the Cabinet Secretary's statement with interest, as will you. But have you any indication that that is something that the government would be sympathetic to?
The indication that came through from the Permanent Secretary at last week's Public Audit Committee was that they accepted the recommendation, and we're thinking through the practicalities of how it should be done.
Right, thank you very much. I think I'll leave it at that.
One of the things on reading this report that I thought was missing and was only mentioned, I think, twice in the report was the Scottish Futures Trust, and I just wondered what role you think the Scottish Futures Trust has had in reducing costs of major projects and perhaps recommending bundling and things like that.
We haven't done any specific work so far on the role of the Scottish Futures Trust and its effectiveness in the sorts of ways that you've outlined and the benefits that are reported in its benefit statement earlier this year. I think it's an area we will certainly keep in consideration for our forward programme of work to look at the achievements that it has made so far and to see if we can identify any areas where it can be making further contributions to getting the best out of the capital investment that the government's making. But it's not part of this report, and I don't feel able to comment on it.
Sorry, you don't?
I don't feel able to comment on it in a speculative way without doing the audit work that would be needed.
Okay. Anyone else got any questions? All right. Thank you very much for coming in front of the committee today, and the evidence you've given we will deliberate on in our private session. So I suspend the meeting to allow the witnesses to leave the room and to move into private session as previously agreed by the committee.